Happy Hanukkah and Merry Christmas, friends. Good morning. I feel like I'm in the wrong disorientation here, but I guess this is good. All right. Good morning and welcome to the Leadership Institute's December Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast. Morton sends his regards as he travels on Leadership Institute business today. We live in interesting times. I was in the office this morning at 5:30 to make sure we had enough interesting times to live in. And so we live in interesting times as geopolitical uncertainty impacts America's strategic partners around the globe. Your Leadership Institute's partnership with conservative governments and allies beyond our borders has become even more important. This week across the river, the International Democracy Union, or the IDU, a global coalition of center-right parties, is gathering for their IDU forum. This gathering plays a vital role as the parties of President Ronald Reagan, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and their ideological descendants meet to discuss pressing issues. Your Leadership Institute is a significant partner in organizing this event. Let's take a look at these comments from former Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper.
I also want to recognize the partnership launched earlier this year between the IDU and Washington's Leadership Institute. Since 1979, the Leadership Institute has provided training for campaigns, fundraising, and grassroots organizing to hundreds of conservative organizers and activists and leaders across the United States and elsewhere. As the IDU's exclusive training partner, we are committed to working with the Leadership Institute to bring ally expertise to our member parties globally. I'm sure you've noticed the Leadership Institute has also provided significant logistical and volunteer support to help us organize this forum. I want to thank the entire LI team, but in particular Ron Naring, LI's Director of International Programs, a long-time supporter and activist in the IDU. I want to thank him, Ron, for his leadership and partnership in forging this collaboration. So I am for Ron and for leadership.
Thank you. Better? Our kind, gracious Heavenly Father, we are so very grateful to gather here together this morning and to be here with each and every one of us and to enjoy this wonderful breakfast that has been prepared for us. We pray and ask that the speaker here tonight, that she will be blessed and be filled with the Spirit. We are also so very grateful for Morton, for his leadership and his ability to strive and lead the Leadership Institute into some of its most prosperous times. We love thee so very much, and we're so very grateful for all the many blessings that we have been given and for this wondrous and most prosperous land. And we say these things in the name of thy Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. If you would all please stand. I pledge allegiance to the flag for the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Cooper. I'm now going to introduce Robert Arnakis for our programs report. Robert Arnakis is the Senior Director of Domestic and International Programs for Leadership Institute. Robert oversees divisions which provide political education and consultation to senior government officials, public policy leaders, and influencers. His background includes serving as senior staff to multiple presidential and congressional campaigns. Additionally, Mr. Arnakis has consulting experience with multiple grassroots-driven organizations. Robert has provided assistance to NGOs, international political leadership, and senior government leaders from nearly 36 countries. Highlights include Azerbaijan, Bolivia, Brazil, Cambodia, Canada, China, Denmark, East Timor, Great Britain, Honduras, India, Iraq, Italy, Mongolia, Nigeria, Nicaragua, Peru, and Serbia. Most recently, Robert worked with the Prime Minister of Jamaica. Raised in Lake Tahoe, California, Robert attended Biola University, where he majored in sociology and political science. Robert is married and resides in Springfield, Virginia. Robert, come on up.
So with that bio, basically I'm to blame for everything that's happening internationally right now. It's a pleasure to be with everyone this morning. I was speaking at an all-staff meeting a few weeks ago, and KJ came to me and said, hey, do you mind addressing next Wednesday Wake-Up breakfast? And not being a morning person, I was unsure if that was a good thing to be asked or if it was punishment for me. But regardless, I'm here this morning. I'm thrilled to be with you. It's an honor and a privilege. I don't get to these things very often, but it's tremendous to see that this program has continued to grow. I've been with the Leadership Institute now over 20 years, and I've seen a lot of changes. One of the things I wanted to do with you is just share some of the highlights of one of the divisions that I manage this morning, let you know a little bit about what they're doing. Historically, I have never seen the Institute with so many opportunities, and really growth has been the hallmark of what we've done over the past year. We are now training people that we... In 1 year, we're training people that it took us multiple years to train previously, and it's really exciting. So I wanted to share just a few things with you. Our division that I manage is the Grassroots Division. We have about 17 staff that are full-time staff and faculty under that division. What it is the traveling roadshow for the Leadership Institute, and we go out and we train on campaigns, and we train on activism and fundraising and communications. And for us this year, we are just doing our wrap-up right now, but we've trained over 7,600 people as graduates of the Institute. And it's very exciting to see. Again, I go back to my time here. I've never seen growth quite like we've experienced this year and what we're experiencing next year, and it's exciting. So some of the things that we've been able to achieve, really, I look back on it and I said, well, how are we able to do this? And really, I come to the conclusion that it's because management stayed out of our way, frankly. But honestly, no, management really and Morton have empowered us and trusted us to be able to go out there and work a ton. battleground states. Thank you. Is it on? Yeah. All right. This year we've had 8 battleground states, and I've had staff in all of those states. These folks have a combined 150 years political experience. They're going into states that are maybe a little challenging, like Georgia. Might have heard some of the issues there. Florida, some issues going on there. We've got a lot of interesting states, even states like Minnesota and Colorado, and we've been able to go out there and do training in those states. It's been really exciting, but it's not just training for training's sake. A few highlights that we've had, we've been going into Minnesota. Minnesota actually has a chance to flip their house this year. We hear a lot about the challenges that happen in that state, but Minnesota, we look back on it, they are really just 7 seats away from flipping a house and having a backstop for conservatives in that state. The great thing about that is we are doing member and staff legislative training in both there and Colorado. Any of you heard of Kellyanne Conway? Yep. We'll be working with Kellyanne on a program in January in Minnesota. We also launched a women's leadership program that I'm excited that we've undertaken. We've trained hundreds of women who are interested in getting involved in politics and in leadership. Another thing that we were able to do this year, we are working with the largest conservative women's network in the United States. We are working with the largest youth-oriented network in the United States. And we're also working with the largest mature American yes, a group in the United States. And we're going to be working with them in Riley Gaines in January. So any of you want to come down to the villages, it'll be a great time. But also the other thing that I'm excited to say we've undertaken is we have an Hispanic outreach initiative. We're working down in Texas and Florida to recruit and train Hispanics in that vital states. And then I just want to tell you a couple other things that we did. So 8,000 people roughly have been trained this year. We've had about 1,500 come out of Texas alone. We've had another 1,400 come out of Florida. But that's not the tell of the tell. In total, we've been in 25 states this year. We've been in a ton. Congressman Hageman, we have not been, unfortunately, in Wyoming yet, although I was there for Frontier Days this year. So we'd love to come out to Wyoming, the Cowboy State, and do some training. But we're out there, and we're looking at next year expanding our program. We're looking to particularly go into the Southwest and the South to continue to build on this great program. We will train hundreds of candidates for office, everywhere from municipal candidates to, yes, even congressional candidates. No challengers, don't worry. But we will have plenty of folks out there that are going to be fighting the good fight in 2024 and beyond. And so I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to share a little about what we've done, what we continue to do. And I really want to thank my team. If it wasn't for their hard work and dedication, and by the way, they've done over 230 programs this year. That's a program about every day and a half, roughly. If it wasn't for their dedication, hard work, and fighting the good fight, we would not be able to accomplish this. And lastly, I would be remiss if I didn't say if it wasn't for our donors, we could not have everything that we have at the Institute. So I want to thank the donors. I want to thank you for your attention today, and I'd be happy to take any questions if there are any. Otherwise, I'll turn it back over to Matt. Thank you so much. Yes, ma'am. It's our Women's Leadership Series, and if you go online, you can actually get information on that on our website. Thank you. Thanks, Matt.
Awesome. So I've got 2 mics up here. You want this one? Perfect. Fantastic. And just to echo Robert's sentiments, many activists, you all in the room, and some of you out in TV land, are very lucky to be able to come to programming here at our FM Kirby Training Center in the Stephen P.J. Wood Building. And perhaps in Crystal City where we have our Campaign Leadership College. But thousands of conservative activists across the country get their first taste of Leadership Institute training through the Grassroots Division. And just to see the growth over the last year and to see the programming and the partnerships has been really fantastic. We adopted an internal communications channel earlier this year that showcases a lot of our stories and highlights. And it has been really thrilling to see what is happening out in the States as conservatives learn to organize and learn to win. And of course, none of that would be possible without the generous support of our donors, many of whom are in the room today and watching out there on TV land. A lot of you got your jars of honey, and I'm certain that you'll be adding that to your tea and to your other drinks as you move into 2024 and we prepare to roll back the socialist encroach here in Washington, D.C. Now I'm going to introduce Bobby Beck for the purposes of the introduction of our speaker. Robert Bobby Beck grew up in the Philippines, but now resides in San Marcos, Texas. Well, I guess, Bobby, you reside here at the Sacker House for now, but he lives in San Marcos, Texas. After experiencing a shift in political views, Bobby transitioned from being a Democrat, sorry, there wasn't a comma there, from being a Democrat to identifying as a Republican. I feel like this bio was written on purpose. Citing evolving perspectives and principles. One of his most important issues is supporting the pro-life movement and pro-life causes. Bobby is a senior at Texas State University in San Marcos, where he is studying international relations. On campus, Bobby served as the president for Students for Life and the vice president for his Turning Point USA chapter. Outside of school and politics, Bobby enjoys driving around the countryside of Texas with his friends. That's something that they do outside the Beltway, driving around for fun. And in the future, Bobby hopes to work for the State Department and ultimately become a Foreign Service officer where he can explore the world and serve this nation. In fact, Leadership Institute just hosted our Foreign Service Opportunities School last week. We had former Ambassador Aldona Vosch of Estonia who spoke, and a number of other diplomats and experts. Bobby is our events intern who also happened to help coordinate this, our December monthly Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast, and others. Bobby, please join us up here and introduce our speaker.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you all are having a wonderful breakfast. It is my honor to introduce to you today's speaker. Congresswoman Harriet Hagman represents the state of Wyoming in the U.S. House of Representatives. She attended Casper College on a livestock judging scholarship and earned both her bachelor's degree and law degree from the University of Wyoming. A litigator for 34 years, Harriet opened her own law firm in August of 2000. She is nationally known for challenging federal overreach, for protecting water rights and users, for exposing federal land and wildlife mismanagement, for protecting private property rights, and for fighting back against the unconstitutional and unlawful acts of unelected bureaucrats. She intends to focus her efforts in Congress on ensuring that it is the legislative branch and only the legislative branch that passes legislation, thereby limiting the executive branch to its rightful role of carrying out the law as intended by our founders. Harriet has dedicated much of her career to fighting for and protecting the constitutional rights of the citizens of Wyoming and elsewhere. Harriet has extensive experience engaging in complex discovery and trials against federal agencies. She is licensed to practice law in Wyoming, Colorado, Nebraska, the District of Columbia, and has been admitted before the United States Supreme Court. In her freshman term in the 118th Congress, Harriet has been selected to serve on the House Natural Resources Committee, where she is the chair of the Subcommittee on Indian and Insular Affairs, and she also serves on the Judiciary Committee and the Select Committee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government. I would ask to please hold all questions until a microphone is brought to you. And now, if you would please give a warm round of applause to Congresswoman Harriet Hagman.
Thank you, and it is wonderful to be here today. I apologize for being a few minutes late. I don't have a vehicle here, so I either take the metro, the bus, Uber, or a taxi. And today, in driving around this area, the Uber driver and I both got to learn together as to why I don't have a car here. It was entertaining. A scenic route. I guess I'll say that we took the scenic route to get here today. A delightful woman. She just moved here. She's just learning to learning the ropes, and so she was. We had several detours. It is wonderful to have the opportunity to visit with you this morning about what we're doing in Congress. I'm going to talk about that a little bit, but I'm also going to focus most specifically on some of the things that I think that we need to do in Congress, probably over the long term. But I think it's critically important for us to be able to get back to our constitutional foundation. In order to do that, I'm going to give you a bit more information about my background and what I have done, what I did as a trial attorney. So yes, I practiced law for 34 years. I was licensed in a variety of jurisdictions. I had to give up most of those when I became a congresswoman. So now I just have my license in Wyoming. But in doing that, I had the opportunity to represent a lot of folks in Wyoming, whether private landowners, businesses, local governments, primarily against the federal government. And what I started realizing many years ago is that while Congress is supposed to be the legislative branch, over the last 30 years especially, and longer than that really, we all know about the New Deal, but really in the last 30 to 40 years, we've seen an absolute explosion in terms of the administrative impact in this country and the regulatory impact. Right now, the regulatory impact or the cost for federal regulations is about $2.1 trillion a year. And that is a hidden tax that most of us don't even recognize exists. It's about $14,000 per household. In fact, it is the second highest expense of every household in this country, only behind housing. So every single one of us, because of the regulatory overreach coming out of Washington, D.C., spend an average of about $14,000 because of this administrative burden. And what do I mean by that? Does it manifest itself? Well, I'll give you an idea of some of the cases that I handled so you can understand exactly what I'm talking about. Several years ago, there was a gentleman in northern Wyoming. He'd bought a farm that had been pretty run down. And there was an irrigation ditch that ran through it that had caused a lot of erosion. So he went in and he cleaned up the farm and he moved that irrigation ditch and actually he's an engineer by trade, spent about $300,000 on this project and restored that farm to really a very substantially producing farm. Well, the EPA decided that irrigation ditch was a navigable water of the United States, and they came in and sued him. And they brought the action against him. First, they contacted him, sent him a letter, and said, you have put fill material in a navigable water of the United States. You must notify us within 7 days whether you are going to comply with this administrative order that we're issuing in putting the ditch back in the condition that it was before, or you're going to be subject to fines of $37,500 a day. So he contacted me. I'm a water attorney. He contacted me, and he'd received this order and said, well, what do we do? So I called up the EPA and the Corps of Engineers and said, I'm going to need to get your file. I don't know what this case is about. I don't quite understand why you believe that an irrigation ditch is a navigable water of the United States, but I need you to get me the materials so that we can decide how to respond. And their response was FOIA it. If you want the materials, file a Freedom of Information Act request. And I said, well, you've given my client less than 10 days to respond, or you're going to fine him $37,500 a day. You can't respond to a FOIA in that amount of time. And their response essentially was, well, that's really not our problem. That seems to be yours. So we ended up having that case went on for 6 solid years. And by the time that we went to trial in that case, he was facing penalties of almost $65 million because the penalties had been racking up since he did that work. And by then, that work had been done 8 years earlier. So he was facing penalties of almost $65 million for affecting 2.1 acres of land on his own property. Now the fines are $59,000 a day. If you violate the Clean Water Act, you are subject to fines of $59,000 a day. I would argue that whenever you give an administrative agency the authority to impose fines of $59,000 a day, you've created a tyrannical government. I think it's completely out of line and something that needs to be changed. But we went to trial in that case because there was no way to settle it. This was a test case on the part of the EPA, and it was to determine whether they could take jurisdiction of our irrigation facilities in the West under the auspices of the Clean Water Act, which would destroy our ability to irrigate. So we knew it was a test case. We recognized how important it was. There was a 2-week trial, and at the end of the trial, the jury came back in 2.5 hours and found in favor of my client, which was a great outcome. And in light of the fact that it was a test case, we have not seen the EPA come back and attempt to do something like that recently. Although you still hear about it. You hear about it in Montana. There's a gentleman who actually went to prison for violating the Clean Water Act on a similar case. I worked for another gentleman over in southwestern Wyoming who built a stock pond. Same thing. The EPA came in and said it was a navigable water of the United States and attempted to bring an enforcement action against him. Because I had just won the Hamilton case, when I got involved in that case, they backed down and walked away. But those are the kinds of things that you see with these administrative agencies. And what I see with the EPA is the EPA has a charter, if you will. It was authorized, and the authorization should define what authority the EPA has. Yet over time, what have we seen? We've seen the EPA attempt to control all aspects of any kind of emissions whatsoever, and control what kind of cars we can drive. You've got the EPA, in this case, attempting to take over jurisdiction of our irrigation facilities. But they're not the only ones. It is almost every administrative agency out there. And just to give you some statistics on what I'm talking about here, the Competitive Enterprise Institute every year puts together the 10,000 commandments, and it identifies each year the level and scope of the regulatory actions that we're seeing in this country. In 2022, the final rule count stood at 3,168 new regulations. At the same time, Congress only passed, I believe it was 257 laws, 257 bills. So what you can see is that there has been a dramatic shift from Congress to these administrative agencies in terms of the legislative authority. And it's not just with regulations. What we now find out is that they will issue guidance documents. An example of a guidance document that can have an enormous impact on an industry is several years ago, I had a rancher call me and he said, I was just reading this thing, this fact sheet that came out from the USDA. And it says by January 1, 2023, all cattle and bison producers, in order to sell their livestock across state lines, which in Wyoming, we don't have packing plants, so we're going to have to sell almost all of our livestock is going to have to move across the state lines at some point in its life cycle. And he said this fact sheet came out and said that we are going to have to use radio RFID ear tags, radio frequency identification ear tags. And I said, well, what is this document? And he said, I don't know what it is. It was just posted by the USDA, and it's of grave concern to us. So I started looking into it. The USDA estimated that the cost of that one regulation would be over $2 billion to our industry. It didn't go through a rulemaking. It wasn't a notice and comment. There wasn't an opportunity for our livestock producers to weigh in. They simply posted a document on their website and said, you have 2 years to comply with this. And oh yeah, it may cost the industry $2 billion, but that way we can trace livestock. We can do it for disease traceability. We have the safest, highest quality meat of any country in the world. I come from a ranch. I grew up on a ranch outside of Fort Laramie, Wyoming. We know where every one of our head of livestock are and where they've been. We have brands, we have ear tags, we have back tags, we have tattoos. We have a variety of ways of tracing our livestock. That isn't what this is about. What this is about control. And how do we know that? Because last year, Ireland adopted an EID requirement, an electronic identification requirement. And about 2 months ago, they announced that the ranchers in Ireland are going to have to slaughter 41,000 head of cattle by the end of this year. Not because of a disease outbreak, because of global warming. They can't enforce it, though, unless they are able to trace where the livestock are. They have to know how many head we have. They have to know how many head my brothers run, and they can only do that if they have electronic identification ear tags. So in 1 year, Ireland adopted an EID mandate, and within 1 year, they were mandating the mass slaughter of livestock to combat so-called climate change. So that's what these things are about. So that $2 billion to be imposed against our livestock producers, your beef at the grocery store is going to cost more. That's part of that $2.1 trillion. We have restrictions on what our truckers can do in terms of being able to drive. Well, that severely impacts our cattle producers, because when we are moving cattle in long distances, if you're limiting a truck to 11 hours and or you have to bring on more drivers to be able to move them, you're doubling the cost of what it takes to move those cattle across the country. We see it in our emission standards. We see it in terms of the education. Just some of the more statistics about this. Donald Trump actually made an incredible effort at regulatory reform, and was probably the very best president that we've had in the last 60 to 70 years of actually attempting to address this issue. Two of the things that he did is he issued some executive orders in the fall of 2019 that requires all of these administrative agencies to post their guidance documents on their websites, to notify us as to what these guidance documents are. Another guidance document that you may have heard of that's had far-reaching societal impacts was a 2010 Dear Colleague letter, a 2-page letter from the Department of Education to all schools and universities in the United States of America under the Obama administration. And that's where they started with the radical gender ideology mandates. That's where they said that Title IX includes gender and people who may identify as a different gender, and that Title IX protects not just sex, that Title IX is not just to advance the interests of women and girls, but anyone who may identify as one. That's the letter where they required all of our universities and schools to have diversity officers. Just a 2-page Dear Colleague letter. It sounds so friendly. It sounds so nice. Dear colleague, please completely upend our universities in every way possible by adopting radical gender ideology and forcing it down everyone's throats and changing the way that our universities are operated. That's an example of these kinds of guidance documents that are coming out of these administrative agencies. As I said, the actual cost of the regulatory burden in this country is about $2.1 trillion a year. And I think this is interesting. If it were a country, the cost of the U.S. regulations would be the world's 9th largest economy. That's how expensive the regulatory burden is in the United States. Regulatory costs stand at nearly 2/3 the level of corporate pre-tax profits of $3.138 trillion. It accounts for almost 32% of the entire government, the entire economy, between the taxes, between the regulatory burden, and the federal outlay of $6.27 trillion, which is what our federal government is paying right now, coupled with the regulatory burden, accounts for actually 32% of the entire economy in terms of government spending. As I said, it's about $14,500 per household. So when we talk about this, and what I have really focused on over the years is, well, how do we address what's gone on with the USDA? How do we block the USDA from being able to adopt a mandate without congressional action, any congressional action whatsoever? How do we block the USDA from being able to adopt such a radical requirement without really any input from the livestock industry itself? And then I think, well, how do you stop the EPA? And then how do you stop the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service? Coming from a Western state, I can tell you that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has an enormous impact on our ability to explore for oil, our ability to graze our livestock, our ability to engage in recreation on our private and public lands out in the Western United States. And what I really have come to the conclusion is we've got to stop trying to address this in a piecemeal way. We're going to have to cut off the head of the snake. And how do we do that? Well, the Administrative Procedure Act was adopted in 1946, and it has never been amended since then. The Administrative Procedure Act has been in place for going on 80 years, and it has never been amended. But that is the source of the power of these administrative agencies. That's the source that defines, and it's a very simple statute. It defines the standard of review that a court must use when looking at administrative action. It defines what administrative agencies can do in terms of rulemakings. Pretty simple, but what it's done, it's actually the roadmap and the foundation and the underpinnings for this incredible expansion of the administrative state that we've seen in the last 100 years, and again, most specifically in the last 30. And so what we've got to do, and what I believe is going to be necessary, is we need to address the Administrative Procedure Act itself. We need to address standing. That's one of the challenges that we have, is that we don't seem to have the ability to challenge these regulatory actions, because one of the first things that an agency will do is come and say, well, you don't have standing to challenge that. You can't do that. Here's an example of one of the things that the SEC is attempting to do right now. Have any of you ever heard of natural asset companies, NACs? Well, what a natural asset company is it's going to be created on the New York Stock Exchange. You can buy and trade stocks from a natural asset company. Let's call it Harriet Hageman NAC, Harriet Hageman Natural Asset Company. I'm going to go in and I'm going to buy the rights to the air to Yellowstone National Park. And I'm going to hold the right to have the air and the open space of Yellowstone National Park. And I'm going to put that in my natural asset company. I'm going to purchase that from the federal government. And then if you want to go drill a well, you're going to have to come to me. And you're going to have to pay me for keeping the air clean in Yellowstone National Park, because I'm going to own the rights to these natural assets. They could never get through cap and trade. This is their mechanism to try to make us pay to actually exist. We're going to have to pay. So they're going to put in natural asset companies, they can buy the rights to our national parks, our BLM lands, Bureau of Land Management, our national forests, even private property. Any property that has a conservation easement on it may be subject to having a third party buy the natural assets associated with that real property. It's fraud on the highest scale, number one. Nobody's going to be building in Yellowstone National Park. It's an incredible way to commit fraud. But here's something else they even say. Foreign governments and foreign nationals are entitled to own natural asset companies. Hey, China, you got any money sitting around somewhere? You got any extra cash? You want to own a part of Yellowstone National Park? And then we, in order to develop oil and gas or coal or uranium, we're going to have to go pay China or the Chinese Communist Party to be able to do that? This is their new idea, because they never could get the cap and trade idea off the ground. Nobody would buy into it. So now they're going to sell natural asset companies. Well, this is a big deal. And it's an enormous deal out in the western United States, because we have the majority of federal lands. 48% of the surface estate in Wyoming is owned by the federal government. Nevada is closer to 80%. Idaho, again, 50 to 60%. Colorado, New Mexico. This has far-ranging implications. When they announced the rule of what they were going to do to set up these NACs, they gave a 21-day comment period. Nobody even knows that these are happening. But again, it's going to have far-reaching implications for our federal lands and our ability to access and use our resources. But here's one of the things that I've been thinking about. Who would have standing to challenge that? Who's going to have standing to challenge their ability to set up a natural asset company? I can assure you that Congress never gave the SEC the authority to sell rights to our national parks or our Bureau of Land Management lands or our Forest Service lands. So who gave the SEC or any other agency the authority to do that? They've simply taken it, but who has standing? I can assure you that environmental groups would potentially be able to challenge some of these things, but the people who are actually impacted, I will also assure you that the courts are going to say, you don't have standing to do that. So we've got to address standing and make sure that the people who are actually impacted by these regulations have the ability to challenge them. And that's one of the issues that we need to address in modifying the Administrative Procedure Act. We also need to make sure that when these regulations go into effect, what you'll see is that the administrative agencies may know that the rule that they're adopting is illegal, but if they can get it passed and get it implemented before the court system can actually work to block it, they can do an awful lot of damage in the meantime. An example are, if you've ever heard of the Sackett case, how many of you have heard about the Sacketts out in Idaho? They bought a parcel of property nowhere near a waterway, but they have spent, I think it's the last 25 years, fighting the EPA because the EPA concluded that their dry land was a navigable water of the United States. So it has cost them. Finally, in April of this year, the United States Supreme Court stepped in after decades of these battles and said, the word navigable means something. It actually does apply. And what did they do? They limited the EPA's authority to do to the Sacketts and what they would have done to my client, what they did to my client. We didn't end up going to the U.S. Supreme Court because I won at the trial court level. But finally this year, they came in and said, no, that is not what the Clean Water Act says. Last year in West Virginia versus EPA, they did the same thing on the Clean Air Act and said that the EPA has never been given the authority to regulate the types of things that they have attempted to regulate. But it can take an awful long time, even if you have standing, to finally make it to court and to finally get some relief. So one of the things that I think that we have to do is we have to make sure that there is a timing constraint, that these regulations cannot go into effect until they have been determined to be legal through the court system. We have to be able to change the incentive for these agencies to adopt what they know are clearly illegal rules and regulations and prevent them from implementing them. Something else that we need to address. How many of you have ever heard of administrative law judges or had to deal with administrative law judges? Well, tell me in the Constitution where ALJs are defined, because I've never been able to find it. I see Article 3 judges. I see Article 3 courts, but I've never seen a reference to an administrative law judge. And I know it's going to surprise all of you, but when these agencies go in front of their own ALJs, they have about a 98% success rate, which is odd, because when they go in front of courts, they have about a 65% success rate. So why have we allowed these agencies to literally stand up their own judicial system? And the FEC or the SEC is one of the worst. One of the absolute worst agencies out there in terms of persecuting people and prosecuting people, because it can take decades to clear your name. And if you have to go up in front of an ALJ, here was another very important Supreme Court case just issued last year. And that was that when the SEC brings an enforcement action against me, I ought to be able to say, what you're doing is unconstitutional. You don't have the right to come in and take my business away from me. It's unconstitutional. You know what the courts have held for years? You don't get to bring your constitutional claims in an Article 3 court until the administrative action has completely resolved. So again, I'm saying you do not have a constitutional right to prosecute me over this. And the ALJs and the courts have said, you don't even get to bring that until 20 years from now, after they've completely wiped out all of your assets, destroyed your ability to trade on the New York Stock Exchange or whatever else it is. And then at that point, oh, maybe you can get some relief. A year ago, the Supreme Court said, If you've got a constitutional challenge to this, you can bring that constitutional challenge. So I think one of the things we ought to do is, if we're going to have administrative law judges, and in some circumstances they may be appropriate for smaller amounts, but if we're going to have them, then both parties ought to decide whether they're going to go in front of an ALJ. And if I don't want to go in front of the SEC's ALJ, they shouldn't be able to force me to do that. I ought to be able to walk into an Article 3 court and say, no, we're not going to do it that way. So that is something that I think is very important. We need to change their ability to use their own court system to adjudicate their actions. We also have to address the issue of nationwide injunctions. I have been able to obtain a nationwide injunction before. I sued the Forest Service in 2003 over their roadless rule. In 2003, one of the very last things that Bill Clinton did on his way out of office was he issued the roadless rule, and that denied access, management, and use to 58.5 million acres of land in the western United States. Think about that, an administrative agency to have the authority to say, we're going to block access, management, and use to 58.5 million acres of land with no congressional action whatsoever. In Wyoming, it was 3.2 million acres. We have 9 million acres of National Forest Service lands. They blocked access to 3.2 million acres, so I sued them. The state of Wyoming hired me as a special assistant attorney general, and we sued. And I was able to show that it violated the Wilderness Act and the NEPA and all different kinds of federal statutes, the Multiple Use and Sustained Yield Act. And I was able to get a nationwide injunction against that. And I think that we're going to have to look at imposing, if a rule is illegal in Texas, then it should be illegal in Nebraska too. Now, there are other thoughts on that, because then how do you ever get these cases up in front of the Supreme Court if you don't have circuit splits, different things like that? I see that, but I think that we've got to find a way to be able to block these administrative agencies from implementing illegal rules. I think one of the most important things that we could do is force transparency and accountability. One of the other things that we need to do is we need to make sure that these agencies are actually disclosing the types of documents, the types of regulations that can be imposed against us, sometimes without our knowledge that they're even on the books. The regulations are published in the Federal Register. I don't know how many of you have ever looked at the Federal Register. But under Obama was the most regulations of any president in U.S. history. That probably doesn't surprise you. There were 95,000 pages in the Federal Register in his last year in office. 95,000 pages of administrative actions in 1 year. That doesn't even count the guidance documents, because those don't have to be published in the Federal Register. So you can imagine that almost every single day when you step outside of your house, you are potentially violating some regulation or guidance document from these administrative agencies. We need to make sure that we have additional accountability for and transparency in terms of these things. I think that it is when I look back on my practice and what I did as a trial attorney, what I really have concluded is that many of these administrative agencies are creating the very type of government that our forefathers fought so hard against. These agencies have become very tyrannical in terms of how they try to implement the statutes that they are assigned or tasked with implementing. We have stockpiled more and more and more power in Washington, D.C. We launder more and more and more and more money through Washington, D.C. And the ultimate outcome of that is that every single one of us are less free. We have less liberty, we have fewer freedoms, we have less of an ability to make the best decisions for our families, for our communities, because we have dictators and despots right here in Washington, D.C. dictating how you can use your land, what kind of a car you can drive, how many flights you can take a year, and a variety of other things that we know may be coming down the pike. That's why I do think that it's really imperative that if Congress is going to retake its rightful authority as the legislative branch, and I'm going to tell you what, Congress is largely to blame for a lot of the mess that we're seeing right now. I mean, we are. For decades, Congress does not want to make difficult decisions. And as a result, they pass what I would describe as legislative malpractice. They pass very vague and general laws. They don't address the specific issues. And then they include a line in those statutes that say, and the Secretary of Interior has the authority to carry out the intent of this bill by passing regulations and doing what is necessary, blah, 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 blah. We have to retake our responsibility of legislating. We have to take more responsibility for what it is that we're doing. And because things have become so complicated, one of the things we also need to recognize is not all the answers come from Washington, D.C. Our form of government was never to have a really strong, big, huge centralized government. It was always supposed to be diffuse. It was always supposed to be at the state level, because Wyoming, we have 560,000 people in the state of Wyoming. I was in New York City this past weekend. There were that many people on Fifth Avenue. New York isn't Wyoming. We shouldn't be treating them the same. Wisconsin isn't Wyoming. Louisiana isn't Wyoming. Montana isn't North Carolina. We have to recognize that there are differences in different areas in the country, in different states, in different geographic regions, and allow for those areas, those states, those local governments to make the decisions that are in the best interests of the people in their community. Because I'm going to tell you, all of us would be living with better government if that were the case. When I read some of the bills, when I look at some of the ideas that go across my desk, and I think, why in the world would anybody want to do this? In Nebraska, it's just a very different situation than what you see here. I do think that this is critically important. I also don't think that this is going to happen overnight. It's very complicated. It's going to be complicated to attempt to disentangle some of this. It's going to be complicated to force our legislative branch to retake its authority of legislating. And we also have the courts to fight with. One of the things that I've been surprised about more recently than when I first started practicing law. When I first started practicing law, and I've always done a lot of federal work, but in the early 1990s when I first started practicing, when I went into the courtroom, I never looked at who appointed the judge, because it didn't matter. They were just federal judges. But I can tell you, over the last 5 to 10 years, when I have walked into the courtroom, what I realize is that everybody in that room is on the same side, including the guy in the black robe, and I'm on the other side. And I have learned that I have to overtry every single case I've ever tried. When I could do a case and do a trial with 15 exhibits, I'm going to bring in 45. If I could typically do something with 6 witnesses, I'm going to come in with 14. I have to overtry every single case that I have to overbrief every single case that I take into federal court, because I am starting out with everybody believing I'm wrong and the other side is right. When I'm up against the federal government, everybody assumes that I'm wrong and the other side is right. That isn't the way that our justice system is supposed to work, but it's the way our justice system has come to work, because even our judges will defer to the administrative agencies because they believe, well, of course, they're just a benign organization that is attempting to do what's right and carry out the legislation. But that isn't what happens. That isn't what happens. Human nature is about control, power, everything that you read about. We've been fighting these battles for thousands of years in terms of what human nature really is. Our forefathers gave us a document and a roadmap that allows us to look at government very differently than they do in most places around the world and throughout much of world history. Our government is centered on the individual. Our government is supposed to be centered on freedom. Our government is supposed to be centered on liberty and the individual and autonomy and responsibility. Not an all-powerful government that can dictate how many cattle we can run on our ranch. Not dictating what kind of a car we can drive. So we've got to get back to that foundation, recognize that we have a very unique beginning, a very unique history, a very unique guiding document that allows us to address some of these things and fight back those the human nature of control and being dictators, and get back to what our foundation is. And we do that, I believe, through revising the Administrative Procedure Act. As boring as that may sound, I really do think that that's kind of the key to getting us back on track. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have about this.
Please wait until a microphone comes to you. I think we have just a moment.
Hi, Carl Galvin. Would you consider that even before the Administrative Procedures Act that Congress abdicated its most important responsibility of controlling the monetary system. It abandoned the constitutional authority to coin and regulate the value of money with the establishment of the Federal Reserve. Also, as John Kennedy tried to implement campaign finance reform. Those are two key issues, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think you're absolutely right. You know, the 16th and 17th Amendments were very destructive to the foundation of our government. One giving the federal government the authority for an income tax, and the other one taking the Senate and making them subject to popular vote rather than representing the states, because that's really where the beginning of the states losing the power is. We talk often about the 10th Amendment, but with the adoption of the 17th Amendment is where the states really, in my opinion, lost so much of their power, because we didn't have anybody who represented the states. Congress is to represent the public, the individuals, our constituents. The senators were to represent the states, and that was supposed to be the balance of power, and that shifted pretty dramatically after the 17th Amendment. The Federal Reserve, I tend to agree with you, and we've got some very serious issues that we're being confronted with right now. I don't know where the Federal Reserve is going to go in terms of interest rates. I'm not sure anybody in this room does. I think that there's some idea that they're not going to be raising any more the interest rates any further for this year, but we do have to address the monetary policy. That is well beyond my area of expertise, but I know that monetary policy guides and dictates much of what you're talking about. Right over here. And I know we have some back there too.
I'll hold the mic for you, okay?
I'm Link Cummings. I move you be cloned.
Oh, you need me to be cloned? Don't tell the USDA. One more over
Congressman
here.
Hageman, thank you for speaking today. I had a question for you about the Administrative Procedure Act. What do you think of, rather than just delaying it until the court's review, to make it so that no regulation had effect until both houses of Congress had approved and the president had signed it?
We passed the REINS Act earlier this year, and the number is at $100 million of an economic impact. I would like to have seen it lower than that. I would like to see it much lower than that. And $50 million is where I would have started. But right now, with the REINS Act, which the Senate is not going to take up, but what it would do is that a regulation that is going to have an annual economic impact of over $100 million must be approved by the House and Senate before it can go into effect. Is that ideal? No, it's not my ideal. It's a start. It's something that we have to keep pushing for. Again, I would like to see that number substantially lower. I just don't think that in our form of government you can be talking about numbers of that magnitude and say that an agency can adopt something without the process that we have, the legislative process that we have set up, that they could impose, for example, an EID mandate, an electronic identification mandate against our livestock producers with a $2 billion price tag based on a 2-page fact sheet. They are continuing to go through with that right now, and so I've introduced a bill that will prevent the USDA from spending any money on implementing an EID requirement. We hold the power of the purse, and what I have tried to do with a lot of these regulations is I'm trying to find ways to defund them. So in almost every appropriation bill that we have passed so far, I have an amendment in there that is defunding certain things. One is the EID mandate, and there are a couple of others. So what I'm trying to do is just take away their money to be able to implement things. It's one of the only tools that we have, but we need to use it. I'm trying to convince other representatives to do the same thing, because I don't know all of the different nuances that might affect, for example, the car industry or the trucking industry. But the people who understand those things, when something comes out of the Department of Transportation or then they should be looking at how they can defund those regulations that are going to impact their constituency.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Hi, Bart Marcois. I used to work at the FERC. I was a contractor during the Trump administration, and we put together a program so that the political leadership could know with a click of a button where any piece of regulation, any regulatory action was, who had action on it, who was holding it up. Unfortunately, the chairman died. The acting chairman canceled the project immediately because they had no interest in making it transparent. That lack of transparency doesn't apply only to the American public, it applies to the elected and appointed leadership, so that the career administrative people could preserve their power. Is there anything Congress could do to mandate that kind of reporting, that kind of tracking? And you use the word defer. Can you talk a little bit about Chevron deference?
Sure.
Thank you.
So in terms of the tracking, the 2 executive orders that Donald Trump issued in October 2019, I would like to codify those. I would like to make those mandatory and get those pushed through in statute. So I agree with you. So there are a vast number of people who've never heard of these NACs, including, I think, almost everybody, if not everybody in this room. Most of Congress, they don't. I'm trying to educate my fellow members on these NACs and the risks associated with them, and they don't have any idea this is happening. In part because they don't know what our administrative agencies are doing. So I agree with the transparency, and I like the idea of making any kind of administrative action is available for review in terms of status and the impacts that it would have. The other thing that I think helps with transparency and accountability is we've got to force these agencies to do a better job of estimating the cost of their regulations, because it might surprise you, but on average, when they do a cost analysis, they're usually low between 40 and 60%. They underestimate the cost of their administrative action. As far as Chevron deference, before coming to Congress, I worked for a law firm called the New Civil Liberties Alliance. They're a nonprofit law firm right over here in DuPont Circle. I lived in Wyoming, but telecommuted and worked with them. Philip Hamburger is the gentleman who started that law firm. He's probably the foremost expert on administrative law in the United States. And they have several cases. I think they have 3 cases before the Supremes this term, one of which is a case that I worked on that has some Chevron deference attributes. The Cargill versus ATF case, where the ATF has tried to declare bump stocks as machine guns. So we filed a lawsuit down in Texas, made it up through the Fifth Circuit. The Supreme Court has accepted that case. That has a Chevron deference component to it. And then the Loper case on January 17th is being heard by the Supreme Court. Deference really came into existence formally in 1984 when the United States Supreme Court said that courts should defer to administrative agencies in how they interpret statutes. There are a variety of other deference doctrines that have been created since then, Skidmore and a variety. So again, when I say that when I walk into court, everybody's on the other side, they all think they're right and I'm wrong, they're required to do that by what's called Chevron deference. The Supreme Court has actually said that if you have a reasonable interpretation, if you as the agency have a reasonable interpretation of the agency, regardless if it's the correct one, regardless of whether it's what Congress intended, if it is a reasonable interpretation, we're going to enforce that. And so when I was trying my case dealing with the irrigation ditch, the court had absolutely no problems whatsoever saying that 4-foot irrigation ditch was a navigable water of the United States. He had no problem with it at all. In fact, he had such little problem with it, he said, Harriet, the burden of proof's on you. You have to prove that your client didn't violate the Clean Water Act. They don't have to prove that your client did. I presume that he did. You have to prove that he didn't. He put the burden of proof on me. Even though I represented the defendant, I went first. That's how skewed these have become with the courts. And so Chevron deference is something that needs to go. I think this Supreme Court this term is probably going to reverse Chevron deference. I think that it will be something to celebrate. But my firm itself has 2 or 3 cases dealing with Chevron deference up this term. I'm very proud of that fact. Yes, that's fine.
Please wait for the microphone.
Can selective regulatory enforcement be used as part of weaponization of government? And how can regular people get a handle on abuses within regulation? I've worked on HUD, land fairness, and Obamacare regulations, and it's not easy reading.
And what was the last one?
It's not easy reading.
It's not easy reading? No, it isn't. In fact, I believe that is the way that these administrative agencies have been operating against individuals. So yes, they very much can be used as a weaponization. And I'm going to give you one more case that I handled to give you an idea of how abusive these agencies have become, and I'm going to target the EPA again. We all want clean water and clean air. That isn't the issue. Several years ago, do you remember when the EPA blew out the Gold King mine and turned the Animas River in southwestern Colorado yellow? One of the biggest environmental disasters in U.S. history was caused by the EPA. I represented the landowner. They came in, they built a multi-million-dollar water treatment facility on his property after destroying his $100 million gold mine. They built a water treatment facility on his property without his knowledge and without his permission. And to this day, have never paid him a dime. That happened in 2015. They have never paid him a dime in rent. So I sued them in the Court of Federal Claims for a Fifth Amendment unconstitutional takings. They filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that he had no damages and they didn't owe him anything. Now, we got through the motion to dismiss, but in working with the agency, they have been absolutely insufferable. They destroyed this man's property and built a water treatment facility on his property, and they argue they don't owe him a dime. That's how abusive these agencies have become. One of the challenges I'm going to give to you today, and especially, sir, since you asked the question and made the point that you did, if you have ideas of ways you think that the Administrative Procedure Act could be amended or changed or modified, please get a hold of my office. Please call us. Harriet Hageman, I represent the entire state of Wyoming. There's only one of me. You can find me. You can find me. I always say, sometimes I get along really well with my delegation and sometimes I don't. It depends on the day. But if you have ideas of things that you think ought to go into a reform of the Administrative Procedure Act, please don't be shy. I've never worked in administrative agencies for the federal government. I've sued them a lot. I've fought with them a lot, but I've never worked inside of them. You people are the ones who can provide me with more information of actual effective reform that we need. And I'm going to tell you something. We all need to come together on this project. I think that this project is one of the most important things that we can do, this project, this reform, the APA reform. I think it's one of the most important things we can do if we're going to protect our republic or reclaim our republic. So help me with it. If you have ideas, talk to other people. But I think that we need to go forward with this. And with that, I really want to thank you today. Again, it was a great drive over here. Got to see a lot of Arlington, pretty town, and thank you for everything.
Thank you, Congresswoman. It is so, and I know I can speak for most of the audience when I say it's so refreshing